Hello, and welcome to our webinar, Queer Peers, Representation in Comics. I'm Sarah Hunter, Booklist's Books for Youth and Graphic Novels editor. Before we begin, I'd like to go over some technical details. The audience is in listen-only mode, but we welcome any questions you may have. On the bottom of your screen is a toolbar with a section for Q&A. If you have a question or need technical assistance, simply click Q&A and type your message into the box that appears. We will do our best to respond to all tech-related questions, and today's panelists will take time to read and respond to your questions toward the end of the webinar as well, so please feel free to ask away. Also, Booklist will now be offering closed captioning on all webinars. To enable or disable captions on your screen, please look for it and click the live transcript icon on the toolbar mentioned above. From there, you can select show or hide subtitles from the menu that appears. If you choose to enable subtitles, you can adjust the size of the captions at any time by selecting subtitle settings. Last but not least, a link to today's title list was included in the reminder email you received from Zoom 1 hour ago. To download it, please open that email, scroll to the bottom, and click on the link located there. You can also download the title list by copying the URL on this screen into your web browser. Today, we have the pleasure of hearing from 4 fantastic comics creators: Steve Orlando, Sina Grace, Hazel Newlevant, and Lela Gwen. Jen Hickman is unfortunately unable to join us today, all in conversation with Vincey Zalkind. Vincey is a library worker in California. As a huge comic book fan, he can usually be found advocating for comics and graphic novels as literacy, promoting LGBTQI comics in the library, organizing his ever-growing record collection, baking, or hanging out with his cat and partner. Take it away, Vincey.
Hi, thank you so much. And thank you to Diamond and to Booklist for putting this together. As said, I am Vincey Zalkind, he, him, and I'll introduce our panelists. First up, we have Steve Orlando, and his most recent works include the series Commanders in Crisis for Image Comics and the graphic novel Kill a Man for Aftershock Comics. We have Sina Grace. His most recent work is the co-creator of the series Getting It Together for Image Comics. We have Hazel Newlevant. Their most recent work includes contributions to the anthology Embodied for Wave Blue World, editor of Chainmail Bikini for Alternative Comics, and as an editor of Comics for Choice for Silver Sprocket. And we also have Lela Gwen. Her most recent work is going to be the upcoming graphic novel Nightmare in Savannah for Mad Cave Studios. All right, we'll get things started. So this will be a question for all of you. What was your earliest inspiration to tell stories through a visual medium like comics?
I would say it started out for me with superheroes, which is not where everyone starts, but we didn't actually have a comic book store where I grew up in Syracuse, but we did have the local newspaper. So in the mid 90s, when Superman turned into an electric blue creature and was never going to turn back ever, because things never change in comics, there was all these news articles, and it ran down not just about what was going to happen, but how they came about, the creative process between designing the costume, thinking about the changes to the character and how he could be different, how he could be the same, what was really core to him if it wasn't his superpowers. And just the creative back and forth that was showcased there was really interesting to me. I was already a fan of the worlds, through animation, through trading cards, through action figures. But it was when I had that peek into the creative process behind the scenes that I knew that comics were something I wanted to get into personally. And to this day, the collaboration is the most exciting and the part that always thrives within me when I start a new project.
For me, my parents just were really bad at the whole parent thing. So the first comics I ever picked up were like creepy and eerie when I was like 6 or 7. So I started just writing and drawing, stories from there just to keep myself busy, and because, that was what I was exposed to.
I'll go. It says like I still have, my mom kept these old pieces of printer paper from when I was a kid, like where I would just draw and retell books and movies I'd watched, but through the lens of my brain. So it was like Batman hung out with his friends, Penguin and Catwoman, and like literally Catwoman's like doing cartwheels and they're just like, so I think that was the earliest sign that I wanted to tell stories, or at least regurgitate stories in, with static illustrated images.
Let's see. So I got into comics just by like my mom reading me Calvin and Hobbes and Edward Gorey when I was little. I was also a really late reader, which I think might have contributed to wanting to read things with that big visual element. Then I was very into manga, especially shoujo. And I actually thought that I didn't like American comics because I really liked slice of life, down to earth kind of stuff. But then when I was a teenager and I read, Alison Bechdel and also some of the European autobio comics, it really opened my mind for what comics could do. And I always sort of planned on being an artist of some sort, which seems to have worked out. And I particularly wanted to do comics just because it's so hard. Like as a cartoonist, there's just so many different elements to manage, writing, lettering, design, story arc, whatever. I like that one can do this all as an individual, even though it takes a long time. And I liked being challenged by these kind of different elements. And I've mostly done autobio or queer history comics. I really don't have the fiction brain for whatever reason. So I'm always looking to retell stories that exist in life. So that's how I ended up here.
I love all of these answers, and like Sina, I think my mom or my grandparents still have scrap paper with my comic regurgitations on them somewhere. To follow up on this, when you were younger, is there a piece of queer media outside of comics that spoke to you or influenced you?
I would actually, I'm gonna like, maybe I'm getting ahead or something, but my answer is sort of like yes and no. I think the first sort of piece of like pop culture that stuck with me in its TV iteration was the Real World season with Pedro Zamora, but I was like too young, and also like, there, I also like that person, he lived with HIV, and the whole season kind of had that as a major plot point of reality TV plot point. Anyway, but then cut to, several years later when Judd Winnick made the graphic novel Pedro and Me, that was the first time I kind of saw it humanized in a way, and then understood just sort of like how radical it was for this person to exist and bring a new face to this thing that kind of only had one awful face in pop culture and media. And that was also one of the only graphic novels that like made me cry. So that all of that kind of just showed me that these narratives can exist in places where I'm consuming narratives. But it was more the book than the season, but that season did slap, and I should try and find it on the internet somewhere.
I mean, I am a pretty confrontational person, so I think a lot of the media that influenced me perhaps influenced me out of spite, but it still got me to tell the stories that I want to tell. Like whether it was representation being there in TV and film, but not sort of lining up with how I saw myself and how I wanted to live, and sort of feeling like I didn't fit I was a square peg in the round hole and having a lot of anxiety about that. And, you know, until I grew up and realized there is no one way to be a certain type of person. But also things like, I mean, I was the right age for like when Ellen DeGeneres came out, and I spent, you know, years with my good friend's parents calling her Ellen Degenerate. And so, you know, I wanted to beat the shit out of them and kill them in a black bag. I couldn't do that, but I could, you know, tell my own reactionary stories to that. And that goes, I mean, that was probably the most widely known moment from when I was younger. That the gay wedding in Roseanne, for example, too. But I was, you know, hadn't really reckoned with myself when the Ellen thing happened, but that was the prevailing narrative in the early 90s. You know, sometimes we had positive narratives, but a lot of times we were either villains or we had these hackneyed sort of stereotype narratives. And again, I'm a pretty rageful person, so my reaction was to do my best to counter that, often in an angry way. I'm not the hugging queer stories person, though those are things that everybody needs. It's not something I can do authentically. And maybe that is because of the outside influence. The fire was set in me there, but it was largely in opposition to assholes, you know, telling stories that I thought were harmful or just flat out stupid. And so it comes as no surprise that the first, you know, book I did the first book with a gay male leading the book at Marvel or DC, and it was about a violent guy who would, if you disrespected him, would just punch your face off. I've mellowed a little bit since then, but I think that comes back to, yeah, like for good or bad, I was being told that we had to be one thing, and that was never me. And that comes from a broad spectrum of early 90s, with my parents usually television, not film.
Yeah, I graduated high school a month and a half after Ellen DeGeneres kissed a girl and liked it. And so for me, there was just nothing really except the prevailing message was, as a bisexual woman, that you kissed girls for dudes, right? You kissed a girl, and then you looked over to the pile of dudes who were like, oh, and you were like, yeah, right? Like it was all for the male gaze. And so it was very confusing, especially growing up in a rural like area, you know, like you had that Aerosmith video where Steve Tyler has his daughter kiss, you know, the chick from Clueless. And, you know, and it's like, what? Like, that's his daughter, right? And so, yeah, the 90s were just a mess, y'all. So it really took until like kind of the 2000s for that to start to work itself out. And I have to say that like when the Willow is actually gay thing came about, I just kept waiting for like Xander to jump in there and, you know, be part of the fun, because that's what TV had told me to expect. And I was just like, you know, and it's just like, no, it turns out that's not what that's about.
And I was waiting for Faith to come back and join in on the fun, so that lets you know where we were at with that.
Yes, actually, I was just all into Faith and Buffy, all of them together, kicking all the boys to the curb. I mean, because they ruined Spike and Angel, and just all of them needed to go. The girls could just stay in one happy household and kill vampires and love each other. That's all I wanted. And that's why I tell the stories I do.
So let's see. So other non-comics media that was queer that meant a lot to me growing up. I watched Hedwig and the Angry Inch with all of my little friends. We were all homeschooled, and most of them are also like gay and trans. And we were just like, oh my God, gender is fake if you want it to be. and Velvet Goldmine, which I really love to this day, just because I love, I find it affirming to see men who are super fancy and sparkly. But, oh, and you know, I watched the L Word. I got all the DVDs from the little DVD rental place, and I got my Shane haircut. But also, like, a lot of the most meaningful queer representation to me, or stories about queer people, have been in comics, I think, because it doesn't have to go through so many layers of production. And it's like, if you manage to stumble upon it, whether it's something that's self-published or a web comic or whatever, it's really, I don't know, it feels like a really intimate connection. So, you know, I was following the web comics that were gay, like Megan Rose Gedris's comic, Dar, that Erica Moen diary comic. And let's see, Dykes to Watch Out For is just like what the L, that's like what the L Word should have been, but it's not possible in a TV format. It's, or at least it wasn't then. And I think it still isn't with like the rebooted L Word. Like, you know, I think that comparison is pretty instructive as to what comics can do or what they can be doing first versus all of the many layers of buy-in that you usually have to get to make a movie or a television.
I was going to say, I'm interested, we're like, I feel like we all probably either in like the local library or like the college GSA or anything, like I'd be interested. I feel like there were 4 movies at least that everybody I know watched in college. One of them, and it was like, well, or TV shows. It was the L Word or Queer as Folk or both. In my case, the British one, because there wasn't an American one yet. And you were watching it on like pirated DVDs. And then there was But I'm a Cheerleader, and probably some Greg Araki film. For me, it was Mysterious Skin. It might have been something else for others. And then there was one called Latter Days, which I'm fascinated if other people watched. These were all made for like $5. And it's funny to me because they're all like, I'm kind of mortified if I ever went back and watched them now. Latter Days was pretty rough. I know. There's also one about a guy who wakes up in a world where everybody is gay except him, which I can't even remember the name from. Again, it was like filmed in the back lot of a McDonald's, basically, for the budget of my rent in Boston. But I feel like there was the like, we didn't have big, I mean, this is pre-Brokeback Mountain. We didn't have any type of blockbuster narrative. So we had these like beyond B movies.
Right. And as the elder queer here, I have to shout out John Waters for being like, yes, yeah, you can be queer and you can be filthy about it and enjoy.
Oh, that's true. That's a great point. I was going to say, I'm actually just a coward, so I couldn't watch those movies, but I fully support them. Whatever one that Divine is like, well, doing divine things, all of them.
Flamingos. That's the one you're thinking of. Yeah.
That's a whole subgenre. I support Pink Flamingos and am incapable of watching it because I'm a huge coward.
I really liked Pink Flamingos, but it is nasty. And you're right. I was kind of discounting indie filmmaking. I guess the issue there is like whether they have the budget and resources and whatever to reach the viewers.
I love these answers, and I do. Now there's a list of movies I need to go look up because some of these B movies I don't think I've heard of. So kind of in this discussion of there not being a lot of material that existed, or when it is, it's very stereotypical. As times have kind of changed, have you found it easier to pitch queer stories, be it your own IP or through an already existing IP that has queer characters?
Yeah, now I feel, oh, go ahead, Lee.
Well, I was just going to say, like when we were doing Nightmare in Savannah, you know, they pitched it to me and I was like, okay, but it's gonna be queer. And they were like, yes. So I was just like, all right, let's do this. So
yeah, I think, you know, anyone please correct me if I'm wrong. I do feel like the tides have changed in the last few years, and publishers know how to get that material to the right readers. And the one thing I would say is, like, if there is a pushback, it would maybe be with packaging that, like, they're not comfortable with yet. Like, you know, I wrote a book for the X-Men series called Iceman, and I think that was harder, where you were just trying to make like a mainstream superhero who is gay, and that was where there were more challenges, or, you know, you kind of had to like talk the decision makers through some things. But otherwise, yeah, I've found that the experience has been exactly kind of like what Lela said, where editors will be like, F yeah, and like it's almost like improv, like yes, and
Yeah, I think Sina and I went through similar things, I think it's safe to say, between Iceman and Midnighter. And editorial, at least in my case, was extremely supportive. But the challenge was exactly what he pointed out. You had people who knew that there was an interest in this content and a desire for this content, but then once it was done, they were still trying to sell it the same way they sold their books to Wednesday Warriors, which was not the audience, and they were using the same sales metrics as books that would go, you know, mainly be purchased, you know, weekly or bi-weekly, monthly in a comic store. So the issue was not necessarily, in my case, it has never been getting support for the stories, but there's a parallel. There's a logistics issue that comes up a lot, at least when you're doing superhero work, because you need, you know, I said this on another panel, like, diversity behind the scenes and creative is amazing, and on the page is vital. They're both vital, but having it in tertiary parts of a publishing company is super important too. It's not like, I think, in, you know, when a queer book comes out with a cape on it and it's basically pre-canceled because of the sales numbers, well, you're not looking at the right numbers, because those are numbers that are used to judge, like the numbers that are used to judge if like a Batman spin-off book are successful, are direct market, non-book market numbers. And that's not necessarily where the audience you're trying to speak to is going to consume that content. So I think the biggest challenge is not necessarily in creative, at least with major publishers, but with learning, as you know, like Sina said, finding folks that know how to speak to the audience and raise awareness, so that when those things are done, you know, it's not Field of Dreams, because it's not Field of Dreams. You can build it, but they won't come because they don't necessarily feel safe in a comic store. And that's why it's kind of good to be talking about this stuff here with librarians and folks who are outside of the main direct market. There's big bonuses to that system, but when you're dealing with any type of marginalized community, people tend to overlook that, like, just putting it in a comic store is not enough. You have to wonder if folks that are going to buy that are going to feel welcome in those spaces.
I dare Vincey to dislike that answer.
No, I love that. And it also, I 100% feel that conversation too about not being welcome in a comic shop at times. And I feel like that's also an interesting road to go down in the discussion of things like Kickstarter and other avenues for comics. So let me, I guess, ask, if it's easier to pitch these stories, if like the creative and all that is there, and it comes down to more of how it gets into the hands of the readers who want it, do any of you feel hampered then by expectation of representation in your work?
Oh, I'll just quickly say it's super complicated, because right now the metric is what it is. And if you are doing the good work of pushing representation forward and telling stories with character and not caricatures, well, guess what? Like, until the metrics change, publishers will still look at you as someone who can't sell. even though that's not necessarily accurate. So yeah, I mean, there's no good, I mean, I'm interested in everybody else's take. For me, there's no good answer, because you want to do what the stories you want to tell, but you're operating in a system that doesn't know how to judge that work. So there is a push and pull for me that honestly I haven't specifically figured out yet. You know, we'll see what comes in the future, because we can't educate our employers. That's not really our emotional labor to do. And at the same time, like, you can only have so many failures that are not really failures, but are failures by the metric of mainstream perception, before you get labeled as someone who doesn't know how to sell comics. So it's extremely complicated, and I certainly haven't figured it out yet.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very loudly bisexual, and you know, with the book I put out with Dark Horse, there was a discussion. They were like, so is there a relationship between the two female characters with the editorial? And I was like, dude, like, these are two people who can barely have friendships, much less relationships. Like, like, these two people are so freaking broken that, like, what? No. Like, that's not the story here. And so it's like, no.
Is it okay if I go next, Hazel?
Oh, for sure. I'm thinking if I have even anything to say on this topic, so give me some more time.
Done. Finger pointing and anxiety, or no, what is it? No, doesn't. Finger guns and anxiety. Sorry, that's a phrase I like. It's interesting because I've built like a nice little corner for myself that has sort of also hampered me in a way, because like, I think whenever I'm faced with the challenge of like, all right, like, people aren't vibing with what you're doing, or your sales aren't, you know, you're not selling like your friends are. I just get kind of like tough and pouty and say like, well, F the rules. Like, I can write and draw my own stuff. And if the whole point of doing this is telling stories, like, I don't care how big the audience is, and I'll just get a day job and I'll self-publish, because I also used to edit comic books. And so I know how to like prep a book for the printer. I know how to source printers. I know how to even get that barcode on the back of a book, which like was so hard for me to figure out in college. But anyway, you know, or just avoid all of that and run a web store, which I'm doing now. And that's given me a bit of this sort of safety net to just like take risks and always go back to like, well, what do I want to read, or what would be interesting to me? You know, but it does stink, because I also want to be considered for everything. So, you know, I'm not out of the game per se, but it is an interesting challenge to try and remain happy and be in the race. But I do feel like every time I do something, it's a question of like, is this bringing another layer to the tapestry that I haven't already discussed or talked about? So, you know, like with my latest book, Getting It Together at Image, you know, it's a book about relationships, and I've done a lot of chit chat about relationships by way of like the 3 autobio books I did. So it was like, well, what's something new to talk about, or what's something new to explore? And, you know, and at that point it was like, okay, like, I think the big thing is talking about like open relationships, not just for, you know, a queer couple that looks like relationships I've been in, but also for this straight couple over here. And just kind of representing the conversations me and my friends are having, and then also still trying to be authentic, and then also still trying to be entertaining, and then also having it look really cool because it's a comic book and it's got to have cool pictures. But I'm gonna say I'm not hampered. I call these things exciting challenges.
Yeah, I think I'm in a different position than the other panelists, because like I'm not trying to honestly trying to like reach these different audiences and do stuff that crosses over in this way. I mean, I've been drawing comics for about 10 years, but you know, I think kind of the entire time it's been like, well, you know, doing queer shit based on my experiences is like a draw and a thing that people respond to. And it's sort of like if this was the 70s and I was doing women's music, like it's a whole like little niche that's carved out. But I don't know. Yeah, I guess it's what people expect from my comics, but it's also what I'm interested in doing. Like the graphic novel I'm working on now, my editor actually approached me and said, Hazel, I want you to pitch something that's some sort of queer history graphic novel, but also like contains elements from your life, which is kind of the most obvious thing based on my previous work, but you know, it got the gears going. And I was like, yeah, I absolutely want to do this and have a lot to say on it. But yeah, self-publishing definitely for comics opens up doors. I mean, so many small publishers are helping fund what they're doing that way. Yes, you know, I was just talking about comics about like poly open relationship stuff. I actually self-published this little guy, and it's just like a 40-page slice of life thing. And like, this is a awkward format that I didn't find any publishers that were interested in doing, I think on largely because of the page count, but whatever. So, you know, it's nice to be able to kickstart stuff. I kind of lost my train of thought here.
You landed it from the outside looking in.
Oh, good. Oh, good. Yeah, so I feel like I'm matching. I feel like the expectations are matched to what I'm interested in, fortunately. But life's long. I feel like I've been doing the same thing my entire adult life. I could suddenly develop completely different interests and have people be like, where's the gay though?
Thank you all for these answers. I really enjoyed hearing that. And I like what Sina mentioned of not necessarily using the word hampered. So as you're carving out these spaces for yourself to kind of take from what Sina said, is there other people in the industry that you look up to or have become really close friends with? The title of this webinar, your queer peers.
I'll go first.
Somebody's
gonna
get left off this. No, somebody's gonna get left off this list, and we're never, ever gonna hear the end of it, friends.
That's why I'm keeping it to one, maybe two people. But I think someone who I just like adore as a human being, I'm so inspired by as a storyteller, and then also admire as a personality, like a public-facing personality in this industry is Mariko Tamaki. Like, I just think she speaks so eloquently and directly about these things, is such an intelligent writer. And then everything she's written is like, damn, I wish I wrote that. So kind of like getting to know her and then seeing her on so many of these kinds of panels has just been a major breath of fresh air for me, because she just makes it look so like, I don't know. It's not that she makes it look so easy, but she's got a good energy about all of this, all of the good, the bad, and along the way, it's been really nice. As Steve said earlier, we've had some similar hiccups along the way. And before this panel started recording, we were talking about how we've known each other for longer than 5 years, is all I'll say while we're recording. And it's been, it's been nice to have someone to sit next to on the floor in a hotel hallway and talk about just some stuff that other people, don't know, they haven't experienced. And it's great to have, a peer that gets it.
I mean, in addition to everything Sina said, I will say it's been nice. It was nice that when I broke into DC, there was a James Tynan there, like to counterpoint my angry bisexual energy with his like calming, nice man bisexual energy, and so that we could have like a mutual eye roll when we're at retreats and people just say some shit that is out of, clearly they're talking out of their ass, showing their ass, doing something with their ass. And it's nice to at minimum, just, to be able to have someone to tip a drink later on and look across the room and be like, look at this clown, which does happen. And, it's, and in a more serious sense, to sort of sympathize with the challenges of your own identity and your own representation, both in your work and with your online and marketing personas, when you are operating somewhere not on the binary of sexuality and folks don't necessarily know what to make of it, and we're on opposite sides of that. We both had people call into question our, for lack of a better term, like our credit. And it's nice to have someone to talk to or complain to, in my case, when shit like that happens. But that said, it's also been nice meeting a lot of elders in comics that have quietly been queer long before I was there. And this is not like a lightning round where I out people from the past, because that's their business. But I will say, going across the country at Comic-Cons and learning that there were more folks than I expected that have been in this fight for a long time. And again, in my case, it's mostly at the big two, but across the board, has been really rewarding. I found peers, as Sina said, we met each other when we were 19, but I found peers in places I wouldn't expect, in generations past that I wouldn't expect. And it's been really heartening because, it's great being there and fighting the fight, but it's also good to know that people have been there doing it for a while and you're not just like on an island.
Let's see. Some peers that are very inspirational to me and I think have had a big impact are Melanie Gilman, who they do As the Crow Flies, the webcomic / graphic novel, and they teach at CCA, I believe. Archie Bongiovanni, who does the strip Grease Bats, which was running on Autostraddle for quite a while. It might still be. And they also did that little comic book, Quick and Easy Guide to They, Them Pronouns, which is, it's great. I love that they did that. I think that's a crossover of comics publishing, like making a big splash in how people live. And Carta Monir, who runs Discat Press, and they're all also non-binary and or trans people. And comics is like my peer group as well as just something that I'm a fan of. So, going to things like SPX or small shows and, seeing so many there's just a whole lot of different gay trans people working in comics, and I love them all. And honestly, it makes transitioning or coming out as something different feel approachable when you're part of that, because it's like, oh, I could just write different pronouns on my badge that I already have and that would be fine. But they're all also doing really cool personal work about their experiences. Another person who I really admire in the industry, although I don't know how she might identify as Spike Trotman, the publisher of Iron Circus Comics. And yeah, she's just made a huge impact on comics publishing, because I think she really started the wave, the newest wave of self-published or indie comics anthologies. Like, she was doing Smut Peddler and all of the many anthologies that we see on Kickstarter, you know, many of which have queer themes or are, you know, highlighting different types of creators. Like, she started that wave with the success of her anthologies and what she was putting in them, and gave people something to model it off of. And not to say that anthologies are progressive by definition, but I'm a big booster of the format. And so I'm just going to shoehorn this question into talking about anthologies and why they're great, because it really cross over with representation and queer comics and stuff. And yeah, I'm in this anthology from A Wave Blue World, which just came out, which is all pairing up non-cis male poets and cartoonists for different comics about, I mean, embodiment, honestly, just different aspects of physical life. And I think it's a super cool project that A Wave Blue World and Tyler and Wendy, the publishers there, did. Partly, I mean, giving people who, like me, who aren't normally into or knowledgeable about that genre, jumping off point for poetry appreciation. And anthologies are just such an opportunity to put different kinds of artists and writers on and get their work out there. Like, you know, with something like this, the people who are the poets in the anthology, like, we wouldn't be seeing their work as comics otherwise. And I think it's cool to, I think there's a certain self-selecting, narrowing aspect of who even has a career in comics or can be a professional writer or artist. Like, that kind of limits the life experiences of the people whose work is on the page. So I think finding ways to, like, get non-comics people who are writing interesting stuff or doing interesting work, and maybe pairing them up with artists so that they can be on bookshelves in that way is really cool. Because, yeah, you know, making comics is such a time-consuming process, and if you're, like, doing all kinds of parenting or having some other job that keeps you super busy, like, you know, I want to read people's stories as comics, but otherwise, like, it's harder to get there. And anthologies are also an opportunity to, like, boost new creators, because, you know, you can have some names in there and people who are just starting out. Like, it's approachable to make these short stories, and often, like, that's a way to make a leap into, like, having some publishing credits and being in bookstores and on shelves is through, you know, taking part in these. And it's an inherently communitarian thing. Like, it can be a really cool group endeavor. You know, you can just, like, get your friends together or what have you.
So
That's something else to say on this.
no, I really appreciate the answer, and I want to jump in real quick.
Yeah.
We've got a lot of really great questions from people in attendance, and I want to try and hit some of them before we run out of time. But what you were talking about goes, I think, hand in hand with this question of in what ways could libraries, public, academic, or otherwise collaborate or support you as creators and editors that you'd like to see, aside from just adding works to collections? Is there other ways that a library could be supportive?
I mean, finding ways, I know it's difficult institutionally, but finding ways to stock self-published or crowd-funded work, you know, would be huge. And it's difficult because, you know, some people aren't even printing things with ISBNs or barcodes, or, you know, they're not being reviewed in SLJ, or, you know, going through these distribution channels. But, you know, I think that when it's possible for libraries to add that stuff or start zine collections or stuff like that, I'm all for it. I remember the one other thing I was going to say about anthologies and diversity and representation is, like, what's more diverse than literally having a whole bunch of authors and artists? Like, it allows you to reflect on, you know, maybe one theme or topic from, you know, so many different perspectives and angles. So yeah, that's something that I love about it too, is just getting to have so many different ideas in one collection.
I think libraries can also, once we get back to being able to do things in person, or even, you know, doing things like this, are a big help, because, you know, you can bring creators into your libraries either virtually or in person, and like introduce people to the idea of comic books. I was at a really, really, really tiny show one time, and I was talking to this person, and they're like, "You write comics?" And I was like, "Yeah." And they're like, "Well, if you write comics, I could write comics." And it was like, yes, we're just human beings with weird hair. It's fine. And so, like, that kind of thing where, like, people actually get to see that it's just people, you know, it's cool.
I know it's sometimes like a really tough hill to climb to get attendance at library events, as I've experienced a little bit here in Los Angeles. So I think if there's any like piggybacking that can be done during like tried and true, like there are gonna be bodies at this thing, and then having a component that allows you know, us to do our thing and show how magical what we do is, that would be great. Because yeah, sometimes it's hard when they're like, hey, look, we're doing this comic book thing, and then you have like 6.5 people in the audience, and you're like, I've still, you know, like, and I will convert them, but it's also like, that's 6.5 people, and you would like there to be a couple dozen more than that to really make an impact locally.
Again, I live out in the woods. You give me 6.5 people, I'm going to be happy.
Kind of on that, and I know, like, Lela, you mentioned that it has inspired, that like you've seen kids who are like, you write comics, I can write comics. What advice would you give to a young comic artist?
I'll go first. The answers are there. There are answers for all of your questions on the internet. In my experience, I don't think anybody actually wants to. I think there are gatekeepers for jobs, but I don't think there are gatekeepers for how to do this thing we all love. Like, you know, there are ways to hand make your comics. There are ways to do small print runs. There are grants. And I do believe in that sense, we are a very loving and giving community in terms of sharing that information. Even I just like upload my scripts and pitch documents onto a public Google Drive folder, and and periodically remind people like, hey, if you want to know how this book ghosted in LA, was how the pitch went to the editor and what the first script looked like. And if you want to know what a comic script looks like, there are no rules. Like, you don't have to buy Final Draft. Like, you can type it at a library computer, I would imagine, maybe, I don't know. I don't want to like, I know there are always setbacks in many ways, but there are answers to everything. Artists even share their tools online. There are people posting videos of how they draw and how they work a page. And because I remembered as a kid, I was like, I know this pen is not what people use to draw comics. Like, how do I figure it out? But luckily I interned at a comic company, but then that was also like, I saw them using crazy fountain pens, and it's like, no, you can just use a micron pen. Like, you could also use a Sharpie, or you can use whatever, as long as you can figure out how to get it scanned. All that is to say, sorry, I'm talking in circles, is like, the internet has the answers. Also, many of us are willing to share those answers if you ask us on social media. Just be a little, don't do what that person said to Lela, where it's like, I could do this too, but more like, how do I do this specifically? Like, how do I draw a page, or how do I scan a page, or how do I get a zine made? And then I think we'll all find our way to help that person, that's also convenient to our time and our schedules.
And listen, like it doesn't, you don't have to ask everyone, but what Sina said is true. Like, find someone whose work you respect and appreciate. And when you do reach out, be ready to absorb that. I've had a lot of people, because as he said, like, the basics of making comics are they're wide open. They're wider open now than when I was younger, in the advent of things like Kickstarter, like Hazel was talking about. There are so many ways to get your projects made that didn't happen back in the day, and that's great. And it sounds like a basic thing, but if you ask some folks for advice, be ready to take it. I've had a lot of folks on the writing side, which is what I can speak to, because I would have to pay someone else to view my art, my visual art. The most common thing that happens to me at a con on the negative side is someone comes up to me with a script they've written, and it's usually way too long. It's like, it's their 100-page opus, and it's a spec script, and they say, well, how do I get someone at Marvel or DC to read this? And the answer is, you don't. Big editors from a legal standpoint can't read spec scripts. And from a time standpoint, they barely have time. Most editors hardly have time to do the work they have to do, and don't have time to read a spec script. If you're a writer, one way or another, and it's easier than ever, you need to find someone to collaborate with for like an 8 to 10 page story that can be done and show that you know how to complete something. And about 50% of the time when I say that, people absorb it. And the other half of the time they say, well, no, I'm not going to do that. Someone just needs to read my script. Okay. But they won't. And I feel bad in those scenarios, because they're, when you reach out to folks, they want to help you, but it doesn't necessarily mean help is not always telling you exactly what you want to hear. And especially in my opinion, I was mentored by folks who were very utilitarian, never told me what I wanted to hear, only told me what I had to hear, starting from when I was 12. It doesn't have to be like that, but you want to find folks who you're ready to listen to, who are ready to give constructive criticism, and who are invested in making you the best version of yourself. And that is a two-way street. You have to put work forth, and you have to take the response you get back and use it to be better. And that sounds basic, but it's actually sometimes harder than you think. And because, as Sina said, there can be setbacks, but that's how you get better, is overcoming those hurdles.
Absolutely, 100% agree with everything that they just said. The best advice I can give is continue, because the only time you fail is when you give up.
My advice is start small and start short and finish it. Anthologies, like pitching or applying to anthologies is honestly great, because there's all these limitations around it. You know, there's a deadline that'll make you do it. There's, you know, even the subject matter might get your brain going and give you some ideas that you wouldn't have come up with purely looking at a blank page. Make your own anthology, make a fanzine with your friends, and ideally think about how you're going to print it before you draw it. Like, not to stress people out, but if you want to have your put stuff in a mini comic, have all your pages have the same dimensions, and if you're working digitally, don't draw it at too low of a resolution where you can't print it. And yeah, if you think a little bit about the print specs, then, you know, whatever you draw, you could put it all into your own mini comic and be like, here it is on Store Envy, here it is on Gumroad. And yeah, you gotta do a bunch of stuff like that before anybody is gonna look at your whole graphic novel script.
Awesome. Thank you all for your answers. I know we're just about out of time. There's one I want to try and do lightning round because I think it's really good. Do you have a favorite book to recommend to a young reader looking for representation in comics?
None of mine. Everyone else is there. Because no one under 18 can read mine, I pass and pivot to the much more kind people here.
I'll just really go quick and say Bloom and Laura Dean keeps breaking up with me off the top of my head. I love those books.
All right. Well, thank you, Sina, for chiming in. We have so many questions, and I wish we had like another 40 minutes to cover all of them. Is there a current or upcoming project that you're working on that you're excited about?
I'm real excited about this graphic novel that I'm working on. It's going to come out from Little Brown Young Readers in 2024. That's the autobio plus queer history one that I was talking about. It's tentatively titled Queer and How We Got Here, but that's kind of a mouthful. So yeah, title not final, but just it'll be a long time coming, but just follow me on social media so you know when it happens.
I will say the DC Pride Anthology is actually pretty darn scrumptious. There were multiple editors just really kicking butt and making sure that this thing, there's not a bad story in this anthology. I happen to be in it. Steve, you happen to be in it. So, you know, it's great. You're in it, right? Yeah, I didn't make that up. Yes, yeah, I knew that.
Go around, bro. I'm in both, and I think you're in both. Well,
no, she doesn't work at Marvel anymore. She won't do that.
Well, I'm in both. Luciano's in both. You'd be shocked. I have a book called Rainbow Bridge coming out in August. I'm doing it with my friend Steve Fox, who's a former editor from Random House, and it is my first like young adult style book. They're keeping me kind. And it's just I'm very, very proud of that book. And it is finally something I've done that is for everyone. No heads explode. And it's about one last adventure with a pet after you've lost them. Sort of posits that the Rainbow Bridge is the Bifrost, and you can cross over and have one last adventure for closure. So that is what I would love everyone to pick up. And on the other side, in the fall, I'm doing a gay slasher book. They could not be more different. If you want like an 80s slasher that essentially stars Peter Thiel as Elizabeth Bathory, pick up this other book that's not announced yet. That'll be out in October. You'll see news about that soon.
I don't have anything that I can talk about right now, so I'm just gonna plug Nightmare in Savannah. It has a bisexual love triangle that ends the way that I always wanted those things to. So I'm just gonna leave that teaser out there.
Wonderful.
Also follow A Wave Blue World. I know they have some very gay stuff coming up that has not been announced yet, but I'm looking forward to when it is.
And I've worked with Wave Blue World before too. They're great.
All right, well, thank you all so much. I think we're at time for this. I wish we had a lot more, but thank you all so much for joining us today.
Bye. It's adorable.
Thanks.
Thank you so much to Vincey, Steve, Sina, Hazel, and Lela. That was a pure delight. It was such a pleasure hearing from all of you, and we truly appreciate you taking the time to chat with us. For more information about each of these graphic novels, be sure to check out the title list at bit.ly/queerpeerstitles. On Monday, all attendees will receive an email containing links to today's title list, certificate of completion, and video recording. For more about Booklist webinars, be sure to visit www.booklistonline.com/webinars, where you can view archives of past webinars and register for upcoming ones like the ones you see here. Did you know there's still time to register for ALA Annual? Taking place between June 23rd and 29th, this year's conference will feature amazing speakers like former President Barack Obama, educational programming, and an opportunity to connect with colleagues and librarians everywhere. Visit 2021.alaannual.org for more details. Not yet a subscriber? For the print reading experience with the convenience of online access at booklistonline.com. Unlock in print, online, digital, and archive access by taking advantage of the special webinar offer to get Booklist for only $75. Thank you again for joining us today. And one more gigantic thank you to our sponsor, Diamond Book Distributors, and our panelists, Vincey, Steve, Sina, Hazel, and Lela. This concludes today's webinar. See you next time.